5 Apache widows arrived seeking refuge and changed the rancher's life forever. The sun was setting over the wide, dusty plains of Arizona, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. John McAllister, a middle-aged rancher, was finishing up his daily chores. His ranch had been his life for decades, a vast stretch of land filled with cattle, horses, and the occasional dusty trail that led to the horizon. John had always lived a quiet life. His days were full of routine, feeding the animals, checking fences, and repairing tools. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and John liked the simplicity of it. The ranch had been passed down through his family, and though he had no children, he felt a deep connection to the land, as if it were part of him. On that particular evening, the air was unusually still. The wind had died down, and even the animals seemed restless. John had noticed smoke in the distance earlier, and now it had started to spread, curling into the sky like dark ribbons. Fires were not uncommon in this region, but something about this one felt different, closer, more urgent. John wiped the sweat from his brow and climbed onto the porch of his small wooden house to get a better view. In the distance, he saw movement, figures walking hurriedly along the dusty trail. At first, he thought they might be travelers, but as they came closer, he realized they were 5 women, moving together with a kind of quiet determination, carrying bundles of belongings in their arms. John's first instinct was caution. Strangers were rare out here, and he had always been careful about who he let onto his property. The stories he had heard growing up about people taking advantage of kindness had stayed with him. Yet there was something in the way these women moved, the look of exhaustion and fear in their eyes that made him pause. They weren't just passing through, they were seeking help. As they reached the ranch gate, one of the women, who appeared to be the oldest, spoke in a soft yet firm voice. "Please, sir, we need shelter. There is a fire coming and we have nowhere to go." Her voice was accented, unfamiliar to John, but the urgency in it was clear. John studied their faces, noticing the lines of hardship etched into their skin, the weariness in their eyes, and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from them. They were Apache widows, he realized. He had heard stories about them, families torn apart by tragedy and displacement, trying to survive in a world that had often treated them unfairly. John felt a tug in his chest. He had lived alone for many years, and while he had his routines, he had also grown used to a certain loneliness. Seeing these women, he felt an unexpected sense of responsibility. He stepped forward, his voice steady but cautious. "Come in. You can stay for the night. We'll figure out the rest later." Relief washed over the women's faces, and they nodded gratefully. They followed him inside, their movements careful and deliberate. As they entered the house, the scent of smoke and dust clung to them, evidence of their journey through the wild terrain. John offered them water and blankets, and they accepted quietly, too tired to speak much. He noticed the youngest among them, a girl no older than 12, clutching a small wooden doll, her eyes wide and wary. John crouched down to her level, offering a kind smile. "You're safe now." "Don't worry." The girl nodded, and for a moment, John saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. That night, the ranch house was filled with the quiet sounds of settling. The women whispered to each other softly, sharing what little information they could in broken English and gestures. John listened from the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of beans, bread, and stew. He couldn't understand everything they said, but he could sense their gratitude. Despite the barriers of language and culture, a connection was forming, a silent understanding that they were all, in that moment, relying on each other. John had always considered himself self-sufficient, but that night, he realized that life had a way of surprising him. He had opened his home to strangers, and instead of fear or regret, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He watched the women eat, noticing the careful way they shared food, making sure everyone had enough. Their resilience was remarkable, and he admired it quietly. They had been through so much, Yet they still held on to dignity, still found ways to care for each other even in the face of hardship. After dinner, the women helped John clean up, their movements efficient and quiet. John was struck by the unspoken rhythm of their actions, the way they worked together without needing words. It reminded him of his own family, long gone, and a pang of loneliness passed through him. Yet it was not a sad loneliness. It was a feeling of connection, a reminder that life had room for new beginnings, even for someone like him. As the night deepened, John showed the women to the spare rooms. He made sure the youngest were comfortable and tucked in. Outside, the fire in the distance continued to spread, a reminder of the danger that still lingered. John knew that helping them would not be simple. There would be challenges ahead, logistical, emotional, and perhaps even social, but he felt a resolve he hadn't experienced in years. These women had come into his life at a time when he had been alone, and in doing so, they had already begun to change it. Lying in his bed that night, John reflected on the day. The quiet of the ranch was different now, filled with a sense of possibility. He realized that life wasn't just about routines and survival. It was about moments like this, moments of compassion, courage, and unexpected connections. He thought of the widows, their courage in leaving everything behind, and the strength it must have taken to travel through danger to find safety. He felt humbled and inspired at the same time. By morning, the first rays of sunlight lit the ranch, casting long shadows across the fields. John woke early, as was his habit, and stepped outside to check on the animals. The women were already awake, quietly tending to chores and preparing for the day. There was a sense of calm determination in their actions, a rhythm that John found comforting. He realized that this was the start of something new, not just for them, but for him as well. Their arrival had disrupted the quiet of his life, but in doing so, they had opened a door to a world he had never known, a world of connection, empathy, and shared humanity. John knew the days ahead would not be easy. There would be questions, challenges, and perhaps even moments of doubt. But he also knew that he had made the right choice in welcoming these women into his home. They had come seeking refuge, but in truth, they were offering him something just as precious, an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to rediscover the depth of human compassion. As he looked out over the plains, he felt a quiet hope stir within him. Life had a way of surprising those who were willing to open their hearts, and John was beginning to understand that some of the most extraordinary changes could come from the most unexpected arrivals. The ranch, once a place of solitude, was now alive with the presence of 5 courageous women, and John knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would forever change his life. The days following the arrival of the 5 Apache widows brought a new rhythm to John. McAllister's ranch. Morning light poured over the fields, illuminating the cattle grazing quietly and the wooden fences that stretched for miles. The ranch, which had once been a place of calm routine and solitude, now buzzed with unfamiliar activity. The women had begun to settle in, and John quickly realized that sharing a life with others, even temporarily, required patience, understanding, and adaptation. At first, the interactions between John and the widows were tentative. Words were often lost in translation, and gestures sometimes caused confusion. The women spoke in Apache, occasionally mixing in broken English. John, who had spent most of his life speaking only English and working with his own hands, struggled to communicate clearly. Yet there was a silent understanding in their shared efforts. Whether it was feeding the horses, mending fences, or preparing meals, the work itself became a bridge between 2 worlds. One of the widows, a woman named Kaya, quickly showed a talent for caring for animals. She approached the cattle with quiet confidence, gently guiding them into pens without startling them. John watched in surprise as she worked, realizing that she had skills he had never known she possessed. He had always prided himself on knowing his land and his animals, but Kaya's calm and intuitive way of handling them impressed him. "You've done this before," he said one morning as they worked side by side. She nodded, offering a shy smile, and though her words were few, her pride in her work was clear. Another widow, Luma, took charge of cooking. She had a way of transforming simple ingredients into meals that were nourishing and flavorful. John had grown used to his plain, predictable meals, but Luma's dishes brought color and warmth to the table. She used herbs and techniques unfamiliar to him, teaching him little lessons along the way. At first, John hesitated to taste some of the foods, unsure of what to expect. But soon, he found himself savoring every bite, realizing that there was wisdom in the traditions these women carried with them. Meals became more than just nourishment. They became a time of shared laughter, stories, and small lessons about patience and care. Despite the growing bonds, life was not without its challenges. The local community did not all welcome the presence of the widows. Rumors spread quickly about strangers arriving on the ranch, and some neighbors whispered behind closed doors. John felt the weight of judgment, even when no one confronted him directly. People questioned why he had opened his doors to strangers, and he could sense their skepticism, if not their outright disapproval. Yet, he refused to let it shake his resolve. He had seen the fear, pain, and courage in the eyes of these women. They were seeking refuge, and he would not turn his back on them. At the same time, the widows were dealing with their own struggles. The trauma of their past, losing husbands, homes, and communities, hung over them like a shadow. Some nights, John would hear soft sobs from the spare rooms, the quiet sounds of grief and memories too heavy to speak aloud. He could only imagine the pain they carried, and he felt a deep compassion for them. Over time, he learned to respect their silence, understanding that healing was not something that could be rushed. The ranch had become more than just a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a place where wounds could begin to mend. Language, while initially a barrier, became a fascinating bridge. John began learning a few Apache words, practicing them awkwardly but with sincerity. The women, in turn, tried to improve their English, laughing at their mistakes and celebrating small successes. This shared effort created moments of joy and connection. One afternoon, while repairing a fence together, Kaya taught John the word for strength in her language. He repeated it carefully, stumbling over the pronunciation, and she smiled with encouragement. Simple as it was, this exchange marked a turning point. They were no longer just individuals sharing a space. They were building trust and understanding. Beyond communication, cultural exchange became a daily lesson. The widows brought with them traditions that were new and intriguing to John. Luma showed him how to weave simple patterns into cloth, explaining that each design told a story of family or history. Kaya demonstrated how to track small animals through the desert, teaching John patience and observation. Other widows taught songs, dances, and small rituals that had been passed down through generations. At first, John was hesitant, unsure of how to participate. But gradually, he allowed himself to be immersed, discovering joy and meaning in practices he had never encountered. The work on the ranch also began to improve in unexpected ways. Together, they repaired old fences, dug new water channels, and reinforced barns against storms. The widows' energy and innovative ideas revitalized the ranch. John, who had often felt the weight of solitary responsibility, found relief in their shared labor. Tasks that once took all day could now be done more efficiently, and there was a sense of community in every action. The ranch, once a quiet expanse of land, now echoed with voices, laughter, and the rhythm of hands working together. However, challenges continued to arise. The land was harsh, and nature could be unforgiving. A sudden summer storm flooded parts of the pasture, threatening the livestock. John and the widows worked side by side through rain and mud, rescuing animals and repairing damaged areas. The shared struggle deepened their bond. John realized that these women were not just guests, they were partners in life, capable, resilient, and wise. He had entered this arrangement expecting to provide help, but he quickly understood that the widows were teaching him as much as he was guiding them. Even in moments of leisure, the lessons continued. In the evenings, they would sit around the fire outside, sharing stories of the past and hopes for the future. The widows spoke of the lands they had lost, the families they had mourned, and the strength it had taken to survive. John listened quietly, offering gentle words when appropriate, and found himself reflecting on his own life. He realized that he had been isolated, not just physically but emotionally, and these women were opening his heart to new perspectives and experiences. The presence of the widows also brought unexpected joy to the youngest among them. The little girl with the wooden doll, once shy and withdrawn, began to explore the ranch freely. She chased after chickens, helped tend the garden, and even attempted to herd calves with Kaya's guidance. John watched with pride and amusement as her confidence grew. In teaching her, the widows were passing on lessons of courage and resilience, and John found himself inspired by their ability to nurture hope even in difficult circumstances. As the weeks passed, the initial awkwardness of their cohabitation faded. Routine became comfort, and comfort became connection. John noticed small changes in himself. He laughed more freely, he felt less burdened by loneliness, and he began to look forward to each day with curiosity rather than mere obligation. The widow's influence was subtle but powerful. Their resilience, kindness, and strength were reshaping the quiet, solitary life he had known for decades. One evening, after a long day of tending to cattle and repairing fences, John sat on the porch with Kaya. The sky was streaked with pink and purple, and the ranch was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves and distant calls of wildlife. Kaya handed him a small bundle of herbs she had gathered from the surrounding land, explaining in broken English that they could be used to heal minor injuries. John smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness and knowledge she had shared. "Thank you," he said sincerely. She nodded, her eyes reflecting a quiet pride and satisfaction. In that simple exchange, John realized how much he had come to rely on their presence, not just for labor or help, but for companionship and wisdom. By the end of the second month, it was clear that the ranch had transformed in more ways than one. The land itself seemed more alive, reflecting the energy and cooperation of those who cared for it. John had learned to appreciate the strength of the widows, their ability to adapt, and their unwavering spirit. They had taught him lessons that went beyond ranch work, lessons about patience, empathy, and the power of human connection. The widows had entered his life as strangers in need of shelter, but they were becoming an inseparable part of the rhythm and soul of the ranch. John understood that the journey ahead would not always be easy. There would be obstacles, both natural and social, and times when misunderstandings or frustrations might arise. Yet, he felt a quiet confidence that together they could face anything. The widows had already taught him the value of trust, collaboration, and courage, and he had seen firsthand how strength and resilience could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. Life on the ranch was no longer just about survival, it was about growth, connection, and transformation. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of excitement about the future. He looked out over the fields, imagining the possibilities that lay ahead. With the widows by his side, he felt capable of facing challenges he had once thought insurmountable. Their arrival had been unexpected, even disruptive, but it had brought vitality, hope, and purpose to a life that had grown quiet and predictable. He understood that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change him as profoundly as it had changed the ranch. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues, John stood on the porch and watched the widows moving about the ranch, their figures illuminated by the soft glow of the evening light. They were no longer strangers. They were a part of his life, his home, and his heart. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, he knew that together, they could face whatever came their way, united by resilience, trust, and the quiet power of human connection. Life on John McAllister's ranch had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The mornings were filled with the sounds of cattle, birds, and the steady footsteps of the widows as they moved about the ranch with quiet determination. Days were long, hard, and filled with work, but the bond between John and the women had grown stronger. Still, life was far from easy, and the challenges they faced were only beginning to test their resilience. One particularly hot summer morning, John noticed that several of his cows were missing from the pasture. Panic gripped him for a moment as he scanned the horizon. The fences had been checked only the day before, but the relentless heat and dry wind had weakened the posts. The widows, seeing his concern, immediately sprang into action. Kaya suggested they follow the tracks, using a method she had learned from her people. John was amazed at her skill, watching as she studied the footprints in the dusty earth and read the signs that he would have overlooked. Together, they tracked the missing cattle for miles, enduring the scorching sun and exhaustion. By late afternoon, they had recovered all but 2 of the cows. John was frustrated and exhausted, his body aching from the effort, but Kaya placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did what we could. Sometimes nature is stronger," she said gently. Her words reminded John that despite all the planning, all the hard work, there were forces beyond human control. He realized that life on the ranch, much like life itself, required patience, resilience, and humility. Just as John began to regain a sense of control, another crisis emerged. A sudden and fierce storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds covering the sky and strong winds tearing across the plains. The sound of thunder echoed across the valley as rain began to fall in torrents. The storm threatened the barns, fences, and livestock. John and the widows worked tirelessly to secure what they could, moving animals to safer areas and reinforcing the weaker structures. The youngest widows, who had only recently begun to trust the rhythm of ranch life, clung to each other in fear, but the older women guided them calmly, showing courage that inspired even John. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind mud, broken branches, and damaged property. The ranch was still standing, but the work to repair it was exhausting. John and the widows spent days cleaning up debris, fixing broken fences, and nursing injured animals back to health. During this time, John saw the widows' resilience shine through in ways he had not fully appreciated before. They were not only survivors of their past hardships, but also capable, determined individuals who refused to be defeated by the challenges of the present. However, the greatest challenges were not only physical. The widows carried with them memories of loss and grief that sometimes resurfaced unexpectedly. One evening, as John was preparing dinner, he overheard soft weeping coming from the room where Kaya was staying. He knocked gently and asked if she was all right. She looked up, tears in her eyes, and for a moment, words failed her. Slowly, she began to speak of her late husband, the dangers he had faced, and the suddenness with which she had been left alone to care for her family. John listened quietly, offering no advice or judgment, only presence. These moments were difficult for John. He had never been close to anyone in such a deeply emotional way, and he found himself struggling with how to respond. But he also knew that offering support didn't always require words. Sometimes, simply being there, showing empathy and understanding was enough. The widow's pain was a reminder that life was rarely simple or fair, and that survival often required courage far beyond physical endurance. As the weeks passed, John began to notice subtle tensions arising from living together under one roof. The widows came from different families and backgrounds, and small disagreements occasionally flared over chores, schedules, or ways of doing things. These disagreements were minor, but they highlighted the difficulty of blending lives that had once been separate. John, unfamiliar with such domestic negotiations, initially felt frustrated and unsure how to mediate. But over time, he learned to listen carefully, to recognize the feelings behind the words, and to offer solutions that respected everyone's perspective. One particular incident occurred when the widows were preparing a meal for the first time without John's guidance. A miscommunication led to a disagreement over the use of certain ingredients. Voices were raised, and for a moment, the tension felt heavy in the small kitchen. John stepped in quietly, reminding everyone that mistakes were part of learning and that respect and patience were more important than perfection. Slowly, the argument dissolved, leaving behind laughter and a sense of shared understanding. In that moment, John realized that conflict, while uncomfortable, could also be an opportunity for growth, trust, and stronger relationships. Meanwhile, the local community continued to watch John and his unusual household with suspicion. One afternoon, a neighbor rode up on horseback, questioning why he had taken in the widows. The neighbor hinted at gossip and raised eyebrows, implying that John might be taking advantage of them or that they were troublemakers. John's heart sank for a moment, but he stood his ground. "They are my guests," he said firmly. "They are survivors, and I will not turn them away." His resolve impressed the neighbor, who eventually left, though the whispers of the community did not fully disappear. John realized that doing the right thing often required courage, even when faced with judgment from others. Amidst these challenges, the widows found ways to support each other, building a sense of family that transcended blood ties. They shared stories of their past, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in tears. They taught John about their customs, their language, and the history of their people. He found himself captivated by their resilience, wisdom, and sense of community. The widows, once strangers in need, were teaching him lessons about strength, endurance, and the power of compassion. One night, as the ranch settled into quiet darkness, a fire broke out in the distant hills. Smoke curled into the sky, and the smell of burning grass drifted toward the ranch. Panic set in as John realized how close the fire was getting. The widows immediately sprang into action, helping him move livestock to safer pastures and prepare water buckets in case the fire reached the ranch. The night was long and tense, filled with the crackling sound of distant flames, the anxious movements of animals, and the determination of people working together to survive. By dawn, the fire had moved past, leaving only scorched earth and a sense of relief. Exhausted but unbroken, John and the widows took stock of the damage and began the slow process of recovery. These trials, though frightening, reinforced their bond. John recognized that the widows were not just temporary guests. They were partners in navigating life's uncertainties. Together, they faced challenges that none could endure alone, and through their combined effort, they emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The struggles were not only external, but also internal. John faced moments of doubt, questioning whether he was capable of supporting the widows emotionally and practically. He worried about their safety, about the judgment of others, and about whether he could handle the challenges that life on the ranch threw at them. Yet, in these moments of doubt, he discovered an inner strength he had not known existed. The widow's courage and perseverance inspired him to push forward, to trust in himself, and to embrace the uncertainty of life with hope rather than fear. As the weeks turned into months, John witnessed remarkable transformations. The widows, who had arrived weary and cautious, grew more confident, resourceful, and resilient. They adapted to ranch life, learned new skills, and found ways to honor their traditions while embracing new routines. The youngest among them laughed more freely, exploring the land with curiosity and joy. Even the more reserved women began to open their hearts, sharing stories, advice, and support in ways that strengthened the household. Through these struggles and challenges, John learned a profound lesson. Life is not measured by comfort or ease, but by resilience, courage, and the connections we forge with others. The widows had entered his life as strangers seeking refuge, but they had also brought lessons of endurance, patience, and the power of human kindness. Together they had faced loss, danger, and fear, and in doing so they had discovered the strength to move forward, not just as individuals, but as a community bound by trust, respect, and shared purpose. By the end of this difficult period, the ranch had become more than a place of work or shelter. It was a sanctuary, a living testament to the power of compassion and perseverance. The widows had changed the dynamic of the home, infusing it with energy, courage, and wisdom. John had been challenged in ways he had never anticipated, forced to confront his own fears, limitations, and assumptions. In turn, he had grown stronger, more compassionate, and more aware of the depth of human resilience. The storms, fires, and hardships of these months had left their mark on the ranch and its inhabitants, but they had also forged a deeper connection. John understood that the journey of life was unpredictable, full of trials and surprises, but that with trust, empathy, and cooperation, even the most daunting challenges could be faced. The widows had arrived seeking refuge, but they had given him something equally valuable, a sense of purpose, connection, and the knowledge that life, though difficult, could also be profoundly rewarding when shared with others. And so, as the sun set on another long day, casting its golden light over the fields and pastures, John stood on the porch and watched the widows working together, tending to the animals and preparing for the night. Their strength, courage, and resilience had become a guiding light in his life, illuminating the path forward. He realized that the hardships they had faced were not just obstacles, they were opportunities for growth, understanding, and transformation. The ranch had been tested, and so had they, but together, they had emerged stronger, ready to face whatever the future might hold. Life on John McAllister's ranch had begun to shift in a quiet but powerful way. The challenges of the past months, the lost cattle, sudden storms, and distant fires, had tested him and the widows to their limits, yet these trials had also brought lessons, growth, and a deeper understanding of one another. Each morning, John woke to the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, and the rustling of leaves in the soft wind. But now, these sounds were accompanied by the energy and presence of the 5 widows, moving through the ranch with confidence, purpose, and determination. John had started noticing small but significant changes in the women. Kaya, who had once been reserved and cautious, now moved through the fields with an assuredness that inspired him. She had developed a remarkable ability to anticipate the needs of the ranch, noticing which fences needed repair and predicting the movements of the animals. Luma, once shy in her interactions, had taken charge of the kitchen with confidence, preparing meals that nourished both body and spirit. The younger widows laughed more freely, sharing playful moments that brought warmth and joy to the ranch. Even the little girl with the wooden doll, once timid and quiet, now ran through the pastures, helping feed the animals and learning from the older women. John realized that their presence had not only transformed the ranch physically, but had also shifted the atmosphere. The air was lighter, filled with laughter, purpose, and cooperation. Tasks that had once seemed tedious or lonely were now shared, and the ranch had begun to feel like a home in a way it never had before. Yet despite the progress, John understood that growth was not without effort. Life on the ranch required constant vigilance, planning, and adaptation, and the lessons they were learning together were often born from struggle and persistence. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, John decided to work alongside the widows in the fields. He wanted to share not just the labor but the experience of transformation, the way hard work and cooperation could create tangible results. Together they moved fences, repaired barns, and tended to the livestock, Kaya taught John new ways to approach the work, emphasizing observation and patience. "Watch the land," she said quietly as they guided a stubborn cow into the pen. "It tells you what it needs if you take the time to listen." John nodded, realizing that this was not just advice about ranching, it was a lesson about life itself. Over the following weeks, John began to notice changes in himself. He had always believed he was self-sufficient and independent, but living with the widows had shown him the value of collaboration, empathy, and trust. He had learned to communicate with patience, to understand unspoken feelings, and to recognize the strengths of others. Where he had once seen weakness in dependence, he now saw the power of connection. Each day, he felt more capable of facing challenges, not just the practical problems of ranch life, but the deeper, emotional trials of living in a shared space and nurturing relationships. The widows also faced their own transformations. Life on the ranch required adaptation, resilience, and courage. They had arrived as survivors, carrying grief and trauma, but now they were finding new strengths within themselves. Luma, for example, had begun experimenting with crops in a small garden, blending her traditional knowledge with John's farming techniques. The results were promising, and her excitement was infectious. Kaya began taking on responsibilities beyond the fields, organizing schedules and helping guide the younger widows. Even the little girl had begun learning practical skills alongside moments of play and laughter. Each of them, in their own way, was discovering the potential to grow, to heal, and to contribute meaningfully to the life of the ranch. One particularly meaningful moment came when John invited the widows to help plan the improvements for the ranch. Together, they discussed irrigation systems, animal shelters, and crop rotation. Ideas flowed freely, blending John's practical experience with the widows' creative insights. It was a meeting unlike any John had held before. There were disagreements and debates, but these were tempered with respect and patience. By the end of the day, a concrete plan had emerged, one that reflected the strengths and perspectives of everyone involved. John realized that the ranch was no longer his alone. It was a shared vision, shaped by collaboration and mutual respect. Life continued to bring unexpected challenges. One afternoon, a young calf fell into a dry water channel and became trapped. The widows worked together to rescue it, using ropes, ingenuity, and courage. Kaya guided the process calmly, Luma coordinated their efforts, and the younger widows provided support and encouragement. John watched in awe, realizing that the widows had become indispensable not just in labor, but in spirit. Their courage, creativity, and determination had turned potential disaster into a triumph of teamwork and resilience. Beyond the practical lessons, John noticed the emotional growth taking place. The widows, once cautious and wary, were beginning to open their hearts. They laughed more freely, shared stories of the past without fear, and celebrated small victories together. John, in turn, had learned to be more open, vulnerable, and compassionate. He understood that strength was not only about enduring hardships, but also about allowing oneself to feel, to connect, and to trust. The ranch had become a place of transformation, where challenges were met with courage, and where hearts and minds were strengthened through cooperation and shared experience. The cultural exchange between John and the widows had also deepened. He had begun to appreciate the wisdom embedded in their traditions, the careful observation of nature, the methods of healing with herbs, the stories and songs that carried lessons from one generation to the next. One evening, Kaya taught him a traditional Apache technique for tracking animals, demonstrating patience and keen observation. John marveled at how much he could learn from their knowledge, realizing that survival and prosperity often depended on listening, observing, and respecting the world around him. Similarly, the widows were learning from John. They adopted new methods for tending livestock, managing crops, and maintaining the ranch. Yet, They did so without losing their own identity, blending their cultural heritage with practical skills in a way that was both respectful and effective. This mutual exchange created a sense of balance and harmony. John had begun to understand that learning was not a one-way street. Growth happened when people shared knowledge, experiences, and perspectives, creating a stronger, more resilient community. Despite the steady progress, John knew that life was never without its setbacks. Droughts, animal illnesses, and equipment failures continued to challenge the ranch. Yet, each obstacle became an opportunity for learning and collaboration. The widows approached problems with creativity and determination, offering solutions that John might never have considered. Together, they faced adversity with courage, patience, and a sense of shared purpose. What had once been solitary struggle had become collective effort, and John found profound satisfaction in this new way of living. As the seasons changed, so too did the relationships on the ranch. Bonds of trust, respect, and care had been forged through shared labor, shared hardships, and shared triumphs. John began to see the widows not just as guests, but as family, partners in life, and in the ongoing work of sustaining the ranch. They celebrated small victories together, like a successful harvest or a repaired fence, and supported each other through setbacks and losses. The ranch had become a living example of how collaboration, empathy, and resilience could transform both a place and the people within it. One late afternoon, as John and Kaya walked through the fields, he reflected on the journey they had shared. "I never imagined life could be like this," he said quietly. "I thought I was content with solitude, but I see now that connection, trust, and shared effort bring a richness I never knew." Kaya smiled, understanding him even without words, and nodded. In that simple exchange, John realized that the lessons they were learning together were about much more than ranch work. They were about life itself. How to face challenges, how to grow through adversity, and how to find strength and joy in community. The widow's presence had brought more than labor and companionship. They had brought transformation. John had been forced to reconsider long-held assumptions about independence, strength, and life's purpose. The widows had taught him patience, resilience, cultural understanding, and the profound power of empathy. Together, they had faced trials, navigated challenges, and discovered new ways to thrive. The ranch had become more than a home. It had become a place of learning, healing, and growth for all who lived there. By the end of the season, the changes were evident to anyone who visited the ranch. The fences were stronger, the crops were healthier, the animals were well cared for, and the house was filled with laughter, stories, and shared purpose. But the true transformation was not visible to the eye. It was in the hearts of those who lived there. John, once solitary and cautious, had learned to trust, to lead with compassion, and to embrace the unpredictability of life. The widows, once weary and cautious, had discovered resilience, hope, and the possibility of new beginnings. And so, as the sun set on another day, casting warm golden light over the ranch, John stood on the porch and looked out over the land. He watched the widows tending to the animals, preparing meals, and moving with a quiet confidence. He understood now that transformation was not sudden or easy. It was gradual, built through shared effort, trust, and the courage to face challenges together. Life on the ranch had been changed forever, not just in its routines and productivity, but in its heart and soul. And John knew that the lessons of this season, about courage, cooperation, and connection, would guide them all in the seasons to come. The ranch had changed in ways John McAllister could never have imagined. What had once been a quiet, solitary life was now alive with movement, laughter, and purpose. The arrival of the 5 Apache widows had not only brought energy and labor to the ranch, but they had also transformed John himself. Over time, he had learned lessons about resilience, compassion, and the value of human connection, lessons that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The mornings on the ranch had become a scene of quiet harmony. John would wake to the sun rising over the hills, casting golden light across the pastures. The widows were already awake, tending to the animals, checking fences, or preparing breakfast. The youngest girl ran along the dusty paths, helping where she could, her laughter mingling with the soft sounds of the morning. John often paused to watch them, a sense of peace and gratitude settling over him. He realized that this was not just a routine, it was a life renewed, full of meaning and shared purpose. Over the years, the widows had become more than guests, they were family. They had taught John countless lessons about patience, endurance, and adaptability. Kaya had shown him how to read the land, understand the animals, and trust his instincts. Luma had introduced him to the healing power of herbs and the importance of care in everyday tasks. The others had shared their knowledge, traditions, and stories, creating a rich tapestry of experience and wisdom that blended seamlessly with John's own knowledge of ranching. Together, they had created a home that was vibrant, nurturing, and resilient. The local community, which had once regarded John's household with suspicion, gradually came to respect the widows and their contributions. Neighbors began to recognize the hard work, intelligence, and resourcefulness they brought to the ranch. Some even came to seek advice or help from them, recognizing the strength of their knowledge and skills. John felt a quiet pride in seeing this change, not just for the widows, but for the sense of acceptance and understanding that had grown around the ranch. It was a reminder that courage, kindness, and perseverance could overcome prejudice and suspicion. The ranch itself had transformed as well. Fences were strong and well-maintained, barns were repaired and reinforced, and crops flourished in carefully tended fields. Livestock were healthier, more plentiful, and better cared for than ever before. The land, once quiet and solitary, now reflected the energy, cooperation, and dedication of its inhabitants. Each improvement, no matter how small, was a testament to the power of shared effort and mutual respect. The ranch was no longer just John's, it was theirs collectively, a symbol of resilience, collaboration, and hope. But the true transformation went beyond physical changes. The emotional growth and bonds formed between John and the widows were profound. He had learned to listen deeply, to understand unspoken needs, and to respond with empathy and patience. The widows, in turn, had learned to trust, to find hope even after immense loss, and to build a life rooted in cooperation and courage. Together, they had navigated hardships, faced danger, and celebrated victories, creating a community that was stronger than any one individual. One particularly meaningful moment came during a quiet evening in the late summer. John had been reflecting on the journey they had shared, thinking about the fires, storms, and challenges that had tested them. He walked through the pastures, where Kaya and the younger widows were tending to the animals, and Luma was gathering herbs by the garden. He paused, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and awe. "I never imagined life could be this full," he said softly, almost to himself. Kaya looked at him and nodded, understanding without words. The shared understanding between them was profound, an unspoken recognition of the growth, resilience, and transformation that had taken place. Over time, the widows also began to take leadership roles on the ranch, organizing tasks, guiding the younger members, and even mentoring other women who occasionally came seeking advice. Their presence had become central not just to the ranch's operations, but to the emotional and spiritual life of the household. John realized that the widows had given him more than their labor. They had given him perspective, wisdom, and a sense of connection he had never known. He had started as their protector, offering shelter and guidance, but over time they had become his teachers, his companions, and his family. The little girl, once shy and quiet, had grown into a confident, capable helper. She learned to ride horses, herd cattle, and assist in the garden, always with a sense of curiosity and joy. Her laughter became a symbol of hope and renewal for everyone on the ranch. Watching her grow, John felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that the environment they had created together had allowed her to thrive. The widows had nurtured her, taught her, and provided her with stability, and John knew that this care would leave a lasting impact on her life. As the years passed, John reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with the unexpected arrival of 5 widows seeking refuge. What had started as a moment of uncertainty, fear, and hesitation had evolved into something extraordinary. The widows had transformed the ranch, but more importantly, they had transformed him. They had shown him the power of human resilience, the importance of empathy, and the joy that comes from working together toward a shared purpose. There were still challenges, of course. Weather could be harsh, livestock could fall ill, and occasional disputes arose. Yet, with the strength and experience they had gained together, these obstacles were met with courage, ingenuity, and cooperation. John realized that true transformation was not about eliminating difficulties. It was about developing the ability to face them with resilience, adaptability, and a sense of shared responsibility. The widow's presence also encouraged John to reconnect with the broader world. He began inviting neighbors to help with community projects, sharing knowledge of ranching, herbal remedies, and traditional skills he had learned from the widows. The ranch became a place not only of refuge and growth, but also of education and collaboration, spreading the lessons of resilience and community beyond its own boundaries. John took pride in this, knowing that the impact of their journey together would extend far beyond the ranch itself. In quiet moments, John often thought about the lessons he had learned. He understood now that life's greatest rewards often came from unexpected circumstances. The widows had arrived seeking shelter, but they had also given him insight, perspective, and a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned that strength was not only about physical endurance or self-sufficiency, but also about trust, connection, and the willingness to embrace the unknown. He had discovered that hardship could be transformative, and that community, empathy, and collaboration were essential to a meaningful life. One particularly memorable day, the ranch celebrated a small harvest festival. It was not grand or elaborate, but it was filled with joy, laughter, and gratitude. The widows prepared traditional dishes, shared stories and songs, and invited neighbors to join. John looked around at the scene, the smiling faces, the children playing, the animals grazing peacefully, and felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This was the life he had built with them, a life of connection, purpose, and shared success. He understood that this moment, like many before it, was a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and perseverance. The transformation of the ranch mirrored the transformation of its inhabitants. Where once there had been solitude and caution, there was now trust and collaboration. Where there had been grief and fear, there was resilience and hope. The widows had changed the ranch, but they had also changed John's heart, showing him the true meaning of family, community, and compassion. Their journey together had not only created a home, it had created a legacy of courage, wisdom, and shared humanity. As the sun set on another day, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, John stood on the porch and watched the widows tending to their tasks. The land stretched endlessly before him, rich with the promise of tomorrow. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons learned, the bonds formed, and the life they had built together. He realized that transformation was not a single event, but a journey of patience, trust, and shared effort. And in that moment, he understood that his life had been forever enriched by their presence. Years later, John would often tell the story of the 5 widows who had arrived at his ranch in search of refuge. He would speak of their courage, wisdom, and resilience, and of how they had changed his life in ways he could never have predicted. Visitors would marvel at the ranch, the thriving fields, and the healthy livestock, But John knew that the true measure of transformation lay not in material success, but in the hearts of those who lived there. The widows had brought hope, purpose, and connection, teaching him lessons that could never be measured, only experienced. And so, life on the ranch continued, rich with laughter, learning, and love. John, once a solitary man, had found family in the widows and a deeper understanding of life, resilience, and the power of human connection. The ranch had become more than a home. It was a symbol of transformation, a place where courage met compassion, and where even the most unexpected arrivals could change a life forever. The widows had come seeking refuge, but in the process they had given John the greatest gift of all, a renewed heart, a sense of purpose, and a life filled with meaning, hope, and enduring connection.